The mainstream media has engaged in a relentless propaganda campaign against Donald Trump that has distorted public opinion and severely divided the country. As we come to terms with the 2024 election, it is clear that news networks like CNN and MSNBC have abandoned honest reporting to push a one-sided story that stirs up fear and confusion. Instead of delivering a balanced reporting of the facts, they have turned their platforms into tools to sway opinion and stoke division. This constant stream of one-sided coverage hasn't just hurt Trump's image, it has left the country more polarized than ever, with people often uncertain about whom to trust for genuine news. In the aftermath of this election, many Americans, especially Democrats, are left feeling anxious and uncertain about the future. By exaggerating threats and painting Trump as the second coming of Hitler, these media outlets have engaged in dirty gutter politics, leaving unsuspecting Americans as casualties of their lies and propaganda. When journalism stops being about the truth and becomes a weapon for political influence, democracy itself is at risk. This is precisely why we must examine how biased coverage has impacted public perception, fueled division, and left a lasting mark on the nation's trust in the press. The media's biased reporting is in full swing in the run-up to the 2024 elections. Media outlets, particularly news networks like CNN and MSNBC, consistently portrayed former President Donald Trump as a threat to American democracy, stressing that if he was to return to the White House, it would be the end for Americans. The media portrayed Trump as a divisive, autocratic figure whose policies would supposedly dismantle the American institutions. However, much of this coverage ignored or downplayed Trump's actual policies, especially his economic and immigration strategies, which were aimed at addressing pressing concerns many Americans share. Trump's tougher stance on illegal immigration, for example, reflected a broader public concern about broader security and job protection. The media's coverage consistently framed these policies as attacks on human rights, neglecting the fact that they addressed issues voters cared about, whether they agreed with the approach or not. The media's coverage of Presidents Trump and Biden has clearly shown a double standard, where Trump's policies were harshly criticized, whilst Biden's clear ineptitude and declining mental state were treated with more understanding. For example, when inflation soared during Biden's presidency, many news outlets blamed global issues like the pandemic or the war in Ukraine instead of focusing on how his economic policies might have contributed. In contrast, when the economy faced challenges during Trump's time in office, especially because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the media placed the blame squarely at Donald Trump's feet. Even though the economy has been strong before the pandemic hit. While Trump's tough stances on immigration and tax cuts were often seen as divisive, Biden's handling of inflation, crime, and supply chain problems received more sympathy, with media often attributing these issues to factors outside of his control. This imbalance isn't just seen in media coverage of the state of the US economy, but in other areas too. For instance, Trump's strict stance on the border wall. He was insistent on building a border wall, and the media criticized this as harmful and inhumane, even though many Americans, especially those living in border states, saw these policies as necessary for security. On the other hand, Biden's approach to immigration and his response to the rising crime and violence in Democratic-run cities were often downplayed or excused, with little attention given to the long-term consequences. This selective coverage shapes how the public views both administrations, creating a narrative that may not fully reflect the realities of their policies. This kind of reporting makes it order for voters to truly understand the impacts of each candidate's decision. The media's portrayal of immigration policies under Donald Trump's presidency and Biden's presidency often creates a misleading narrative, particularly regarding deportations and border enforcement. Trump's tough stance on immigration, including stricter enforcement and increased deportations, was frequently described by the media as heartless, especially with the controversial practice of detaining children in cages at the border. However, this policy, which became a flashpoint of criticism, actually began under President Barack Obama, not Trump. The media misled the public into thinking that Trump specifically implemented a policy to lock children in cages and separate them from their families, when in reality, this was an Obama-era practice that Trump inherited. The public's outrage was further fueled when Kamala Harris, as the border czar, and the media broadcast selective images of children in detention facilities. What many Americans did not realize is that deportation rates under Trump were lower than under Obama, who deported over 5.3 million people during his 2 terms. And that compared to Trump 2 million and Biden's 1.1 million. Trump's administration focused more on individuals with criminal records or other serious immigration violations. Meanwhile, illegal border encounters dropped significantly during Trump's term. In contrast, under Biden, illegal immigration surged to record levels. Despite this, the media largely framed the issue as a result of broader systemic factors like economic instability and political turmoil in other countries, rather than a failure of the Biden administration's policy. This selective coverage created a misleading narrative that painted Trump's policies as harsher while downplaying the challenges Biden faced at the border. When Trump implemented his 2017 tax cut, the media told the American people that Trump was cutting the taxes of his wealthy friends and donors while totally ignoring the full impact of his policies on the economy. What the media did not report is that under Trump, the economy grew at an average rate of 2.5% per year, stronger than Obama's second term and far better than Biden's early years, especially in 2022 when inflation soared above 8% under Biden, creating a situation where many Americans could not afford to buy goods and services. One of the most important things that the media did not report was the increase in the income of the average American. During Trump's presidency, wages for low-income workers, especially those without a college degree, grew faster than under previous administrations. According to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, real wages, that is, wages adjusted for inflation, increased more under Trump than under Obama, providing a significant boost to workers who needed it the most. But instead of reporting on these positive economic outcomes, the media mostly covered controversies surrounding his administration, like the tax cut themselves, or his handling of certain foreign policies. Trump introduced policies that reduced government restrictions and regulations, making it easier for businesses to expand and hire more workers. This created a more business-friendly environment, which was reflected in the Small Business Optimism Index reaching record high in 2019. Small business owners felt confident about the economy and their future under Trump's policies. However, the media often downplayed these positive statistics, instead focusing on the idea that his policies only helped big corporations or worsened the national deficit. In contrast, Biden's policies, especially his massive spending during the pandemic recovery and infrastructure plans, contributed to the rising inflation that ate into the workers' paychecks. Inflation reached a 40-year high in 2022, which meant that even as wages were increasing, workers still saw a massive reduction in the purchasing power of their money. While Biden's policies may have helped in some areas, they also fueled economic problems that were rarely addressed in the same way that the media covered Trump's challenges. When it came to foreign policy, the media often mischaracterized President Trump's approach as quote unquote isolationist. I am of the view, now this is totally my opinion here, right, that much of the propaganda reported on Trump's foreign policy was fueled by the three-letter intelligence agencies and the military-industrial complex. In reality, Trump's foreign policy was about reducing unnecessary US involvement in expensive and endless wars, especially in places like Afghanistan, where American troops have been for nearly 2 decades. Trump's goal was to bring troops home, not abandon allies, and this approach was actually supported by most Americans, according to public opinion polls. Many Americans were tired of the prolonged military interventions and wanted the US to focus more on domestic issues. But the media often painted this as the US retreating from the world, ignoring the fact that pulling back from these conflicts was in many ways a reflection of the people's desire to stop these quote-unquote forever wars. One of the most glaring examples of how Trump's foreign policy was misrepresented was his dealings with North Korea's Kim Jong-un and Russia's Vladimir Putin. Media outlets frequently accused Trump of quote-unquote cozying up to dictators, especially after his meeting with Kim and Putin. But what the media failed to emphasize was that these meetings were historic and led to real steps toward peace. When Trump met with Kim Jong-un, it was the first time a sitting US president has ever sat down with the North Korean leader. This opened up communication channels and led to a temporary reduction in missile tests and tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Similarly, Trump's approach to Russia, while controversial, was centered on keeping direct lines of communication open to avoid misunderstandings and prevent potential conflicts. His meetings with Putin were part of this strategy, and although critics focused on his tone, the reality was that Trump kept Russia at bay through tough sanctions and military support to NATO allies. By contrast, Biden's handling of foreign relations, especially the tumultuous withdrawal from Afghanistan, was a clear disaster. The decision to pull out US troops from Afghanistan was made by Biden, but the execution of this plan was chaotic and poorly managed. The abrupt withdrawal led to the rapid collapse of the Afghan government, the swift takeover of the country by the Taliban, and a disastrous evacuation of American citizens and allies. Images of people desperately clinging to planes as Kabul's airport became symbols of botched exit. While the media initially reported on the disaster, coverage quickly faded and the long-term costs were not fully highlighted. The failure to plan and execute this withdrawal cost the lives of American soldiers, endangered Afghan lives who had worked with the US and left behind billions of dollars worth of military equipment. This was a colossal failure in leadership. Yet, the media's scrutiny of Biden's foreign policy has been far less intense compared to how they treated Trump's dealings with dictators. Trump's foreign policy aimed to bring troops home, reduce US involvement in unnecessary wars, and engage with world leaders in a way that could lead to peace. His meetings with Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin were controversial, but they were steps towards reducing global tensions, not signs of weakness. On the other hand, Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan was a clear failure, which led to disastrous consequences for both the US and Afghanistan, and yet the media gave this crisis far less attention compared to the constant criticisms Trump faced for his approach to foreign relations. When it comes to social and cultural issues, the media's portrayal of Donald Trump was often very different from the reality. On topics like LGBTQ plus rights, religious freedom, and education, the mainstream media frequently painted Trump as someone who was hostile to LGBTQ people, religious groups, and immigrant communities. However, when you look at his actual policies, the truth is more complicated. Take Trump's stance on LGBTQ rights, for example. When his administration faced criticism for certain policies like the ban on transgender people serving in the military, it is important to recognize that he also took steps to support LGBTQ rights in other ways. For example, Trump appointed Richard Garnell as the first openly gay person to serve in a cabinet position as the US ambassador to Germany. His administration also supported the right of LGBTQ people to live free from discrimination in housing and employment. But the media mostly focused on the negatives, often ignoring that there were inclusive actions and instead framing Trump as someone who was anti-LGBTQ, even though that wasn't really his position. The media's portrayal of Trump's immigration policies also did not reflect the views of many Americans. For example, Trump's focus on securing the US border and limiting illegal immigration was often labeled as anti-immigration. But in reality, many Americans, including immigrants, supported stricter border controls. Polls constantly showed that a majority of Americans felt that the US needed stronger immigration enforcement to protect jobs and national security, but the media focused on the most extreme portrayals of Trump's policies, often ignoring the fact that many Americans saw these efforts as a reasonable way to address the immigration issues. In contrast, under Joe Biden's administration, many Americans felt that social and cultural issues were taken in a direction that were uncomfortable. One of the biggest concerns among parents, particularly those from religious communities, was the push for policies that involved exposing young children to ideas and concepts about gender and sexuality that many felt were inappropriate. For instance, under Biden, there was increased support for this drag queen story time in schools and the introduction of books that many parents considered sexually explicit or inappropriate for young children. In addition, policies allowing boys who identify as girls but were born as males to use girls' bathrooms and participate in girls' sports raised alarms amongst many parents, particularly mothers of young girls. Many worried about the safety and fairness of these policies. Perhaps most troubling to many Americans was the Biden administration's support for gender transition surgeries for minors. The idea of allowing children to undergo surgeries to change their gender identity raised concerns about parents' rights, medical ethics, and the long-term impact on young people who might not fully understand the consequences of such decisions. For many parents, especially those who are Christians or from traditional backgrounds, this was a major point of conflict. However, instead of engaging in a serious discussion about these concerns, the media often dismissed them as homophobic or transphobic. Anyone who questioned policies like drag queen storytime or the inclusion of transgender women in women's sports was labeled as intolerant or hateful, even though many of these individuals were simply concerned about what they felt was being forced onto their children. In this way, the media helped stoke fear in the LGBT community, painting Trump as someone who hated LGBTQ people, when in fact, his policies did not reflect that narrative. By contrast, it was the Biden administration that stirred up cultural tensions, particularly when it came to gender identity and children. Biden and Kamala Harris were vocal in their support for policies that many Americans saw as pushing radical sexual and gender ideologies into the public sphere, particularly in schools. These policies, combined with the media's framing of anyone who disagreed as quote-unquote bigoted or quote-unquote homophobic, made it difficult for parents to voice their concerns without being labeled as intolerant. A failure to serve the public's interest. The media's role is supposed to be one of providing accurate, objective reporting. Yet, by largely abandoning these principles, major news networks have contributed to a divided and misinformed public. A Gallup poll conducted in 2023 found that trust in the media had hit an all-time low, with only 34% of Americans saying that they trusted the information they received from news sources. For those Democratic voters who are now deeply anxious about Trump's presidency, this fear has been exacerbated by the narratives promoted by the mainstream media. Many are now facing unnecessary dread about the future of the country, dread that upon closer inspection lacks the foundation of factual reporting. For example, a recent survey by the American Psychological Association revealed that 48% of Biden voters feel, quote unquote, extremely anxious about Trump's policies or healthcare and social security, despite no immediate plans by Trump's administration to dismantle these programs. It is time for Americans to demand accountability from news outlets. The unchecked power of the media to shape narratives has had far-reaching consequences on the political landscape. As we move forward, it is essential that citizens become more discerning customers and consumers of information. Instead of relying solely on mainstream news outlets, Americans can diversify their media sources, consult independent news sites, and prioritize fact-checking. With the advent of digital platforms, verifying primary sources has become easier than ever. Instead of passively absorbing narratives, voters should seek out diverse perspectives and cross-reference claims with multiple sources. The importance of media literacy cannot be overstated in an era where partisanship has infiltrated journalistic integrity. The 2024 election has exposed glaring flaws in media coverage that skewed public perception and created unnecessary division. For a healthier democracy, Americans must hold the media accountable and foster a culture where information is scrutinized rather than blindly accepted. To preserve democratic integrity, it is important that Americans reject sensationalism and demand honest reporting. This election cycle has proven that fear-mongering and selective coverage are tactics that do not serve the best interest of the public. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.